Hey people, get ready to crush everyday TOEFL iBT tests for all modules and make your dreams come true. I'm your motivator and I'll be guiding you through the test prep videos. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe or you'll be missing out on some serious preparation.
Conversation 1. You will hear a conversation. A female student visits the financial aid office to speak with an advisor named Mr. Collins about her scholarship renewal and an unexpected gap in her aid package for the upcoming semester. First, you have some time to look at the 5 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions. Hi, excuse me. I was told I could speak with someone about my financial aid package. I got a letter last week saying my renewable scholarship wasn't renewed for next semester, and I'm honestly not sure what happened.
Of course, come on in. I'm Mr. Collins. Let me pull up your account. Can I get your student ID number?
Sure, it's 88472219.
Okay, here we go. So I can see your Merit Scholars Award. It looks like your GPA for the spring semester came in at 2.89, and the scholarship requires a minimum of 3.0 to renew. That's why it wasn't continued.
Oh. I didn't realize it had dropped that much. I had a really difficult semester. I was dealing with a family emergency midterm and missed several weeks of classes.
I'm sorry to hear that. Did you file any kind of hardship documentation with the Dean of Students' office at the time?
I didn't know that was something I could do. Nobody told me about that option.
Well, that's actually very relevant here. If you experienced a documented hardship that affected your academic performance, you do have the right to appeal the scholarship termination. The appeal process involves submitting a written statement, any supporting documentation, medical records, a letter from a family member, that sort of thing, and a recommendation from a faculty member who can speak to your academic potential.
That sounds doable. How long does the appeal process take? Because I need to register for next semester's classes and I'm worried about being able to afford tuition without the scholarship.
The appeals committee meets on the first and third Tuesday of each month. If you submit your materials at least 5 business days before a meeting date, your case will be reviewed at that session. Given that today is June 9th, the next committee meeting is June 16th, so you'd need everything in by this Wednesday, the 11th.
That's really tight. I'm not sure I can get all of that together by Wednesday.
I understand. In that case, you'd be looking at the July 7th meeting, with a submission deadline of July 1st. In the meantime, you might want to consider applying for a short-term emergency loan through our office. It's interest-free for up to 90 days and can cover tuition while your appeal is pending. That way you can register and hold your spot in classes.
Oh, I didn't know that existed. That could actually be really helpful. Would the emergency loan affect my appeal in any way?
Not at all. They're completely separate processes. The loan is just a bridge to keep you enrolled. Think of it as a safety net while we work on the longer-term solution.
Okay. I think I'll go with the July timeline for the appeal so I can put together a strong case and apply for the emergency loan today if possible.
That sounds like a smart plan. I'll get you started on the emergency loan application right now. And here's a printed checklist of everything you'll need for the appeal. My strong advice is to reach out to a professor who knows your work well. The personal recommendation carries a lot of weight with the committee.
Thank you so much. I was really stressed coming in here, but this feels a lot more manageable now.
That's what we're here for. Good luck, and don't hesitate to come back if you have more questions as you put the appeal together.
That is the end of the conversation 1. You now have some time to answer the questions. Conversation 2. You will hear a conversation. A male student visits the Student Services Housing Office to speak with a staff member named Ms. Rivera about an issue with his dormitory room assignment for the fall semester and a possible room change request. First, you have some time to look at the 5 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions.
Hi there. I'm hoping someone can help me. I got my housing assignment for the fall semester last week, and I've been placed in Hartwell Hall, but I specifically requested a quiet floor in my application. Hartwell is listed as a social community hall, which is kind of the opposite of what I need.
Hi, welcome to Student Services. I'm Ms. Rivera. I'd be happy to look into that for you. Can I get your name and student ID?
Sure, I'm Daniel Park, student ID 9235561.
Okay, Daniel, I've got your file here. I can see you did indicate a preference for a quiet study floor on your housing application. Unfortunately, our quiet designated floors, those are in Alderman Hall and Whitmore Hall, filled up very quickly this cycle. You were placed on our waiting list for those floors and assigned to Hartwell as a temporary placement.
Oh, I didn't realize I was on a waiting list. The letter I got just said Hartwell Hall, room 214. There was no mention of a waiting list at all.
You're right, and I apologize for that. The assignment letters that went out last week had a formatting error. The waiting list status line was accidentally omitted. We've actually been fielding quite a few calls about that today. That oversight is on us, and I'm sorry for the confusion it caused.
Okay, so where am I on the waiting list? Is there a realistic chance I'd get moved before the semester starts?
You're currently number 7 on the Alderman waitlist and number 4 on the Whitmore waitlist. Historically, we see significant movement on these lists between now and early August, because students who were assigned to quiet floors sometimes change their plans, they study abroad, take a gap semester, move off campus, that kind of thing. Last year, both lists moved by at least 5 spots before move-in day.
That's actually somewhat encouraging. So there's a decent chance the Whitmore spot could come through?
It's definitely possible. I wouldn't call it guaranteed, but being 4th on Whitmore is a reasonable position. The best thing you can do is make sure your contact information is current in the system, because we notify students by email the moment a spot opens, and you'll have 48 hours to accept or decline. If we don't hear back within that window, your spot goes to the next person on the list.
Okay, I'll double-check my email address in the portal right away. Is there anything else I can do to improve my chances, or is it purely a waiting game at this point?
Mostly a waiting game, I'm afraid. However, I will flag your file with a note about the notification error on your letter, just to make sure your case gets a second look if there's any discretionary room at all. I can't promise anything, but it won't hurt.
I really appreciate that. In the meantime, is Hartwell Hall at least manageable for someone who needs to study a lot? I was worried it might be too noisy.
Hartwell does have a social atmosphere, especially on weekends, but there is a designated study lounge on the second floor that has enforced quiet hours from 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. daily. A lot of residents who aren't on the quiet floor still use it as their primary study space. Also, your room, 214, is actually at the end of the hall near the fire exit, which tends to be one of the quieter spots in that building.
That's good to know. I feel a little better about it. I guess I can make it work if the Whitmore spot doesn't come through.
That's a great attitude. And honestly, Daniel, with you at number 4 on Whitmore, I'd say the odds are in your favor. Just keep an eye on that inbox and respond quickly if you hear from us.
Will do. Thank you so much, Ms. Rivera. You've been really helpful.
Of course. Good luck with the new semester, and don't hesitate to stop by if anything else comes up. That is the end of the conversation too. You now have some time to answer the questions. Lecture 1. You will hear part of a lecture about environmental science. Coral reef ecosystems. First, you have some time to look at the 6 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions.
Alright, let's get started. Today we're going to talk about coral reef ecosystems, and I want to be very clear from the outset that coral reefs are far more complex than most people realize. When you look at a coral reef, you might think you're looking at a rock formation, but you're actually looking at a living structure built by tiny animals called coral polyps. These polyps secrete calcium carbonate, essentially limestone, to form the hard skeletal structures we associate with reefs. Over thousands of years, layer upon layer of these skeletons accumulate to create the massive reef structures we see today. Now, coral reefs occupy less than 1% of the ocean floor, yet they support an estimated 25% of all marine species. That's an extraordinary ratio. Why are they so productive? A lot of it has to do with a symbiotic relationship between the coral polyps and microscopic algae called zooxanthellae. These algae live inside the coral tissue, and through photosynthesis, they produce sugars that the coral uses as an energy source. In return, the coral provides the algae with shelter and the nutrients they need to photosynthesize. It's a beautifully efficient partnership. But here's where things get concerning. When ocean temperatures rise, even by just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius above the normal seasonal maximum, the coral polyps become stressed and expel the zooxanthellae from their tissues. Without the algae, the coral loses its color and turns white. We call this coral bleaching. And without the energy the algae provide, the coral can starve and die if the stress persists long enough. Mass bleaching events, which were once rare, are now occurring with alarming frequency due to climate change. There's another major threat I want to discuss: ocean acidification. As carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere increase, more CO2 dissolves into seawater, forming carbonic acid. This lowers the pH of the ocean, making it more acidic. The problem for corals is that acidic water actually dissolves calcium carbonate, the very material reefs are made of. So not only does acidification make it harder for corals to build their skeletons, it can actively erode existing reef structures. Research published in the last decade shows that some reef systems are now eroding faster than they can grow.
Student, Professor Hartwell, I've read that some reefs are more resilient than others. Is that true, and what makes certain reefs better able to survive these stressors?
That's an excellent question, and yes, reef resilience is actually one of the most active research areas in marine biology right now. Several factors contribute to resilience. First, genetic diversity within coral populations matters enormously. Reefs with a wider variety of coral species and genotypes are better equipped to cope with changing conditions because some individuals may carry heat-tolerant traits. Second, water quality plays a role. Reefs in areas with low levels of agricultural runoff and pollution tend to fare better. Third, effective local management, things like reducing fishing pressure and controlling coastal development, can significantly improve a reef's capacity to recover after bleaching events. Scientists are also exploring assisted evolution, essentially selectively breeding or even gene editing corals to be more heat-resistant. It's controversial, but with the pace of warming, some researchers argue we may not have the luxury of waiting for natural adaptation.
That is the end of the lecture 1. You now have some time to answer the questions. Lecture 2. You will hear part of a lecture about linguistics. Creole language development. First, you have some time to look at the 6 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. Last week we discussed pidgin languages, those simplified contact languages that emerge when groups of people who don't share a common tongue need to communicate, typically for trade or labor. Today I want to take the next logical step and talk about what happens when a pidgin becomes the native language of a community. When that occurs, something remarkable happens. The language undergoes a rapid and dramatic expansion in grammatical complexity, vocabulary, and expressive range. The resulting language is what linguists call a Creole. The historical context for most Creole languages is deeply tied to colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade. When enslaved Africans from many different linguistic backgrounds were forcibly brought together on Caribbean and American plantations, they needed a shared means of communication both with each other and with their colonizers. A pidgin would first develop for basic communication, but when children were born into these communities and grew up hearing only the pidgin, they naturally began to nativize it, that is, to use it as their first language. And crucially, children don't just inherit what they hear. They systematically fill in the grammatical gaps, adding tense markers, aspect markers, a richer pronoun system, and more complex sentence structures. This is the transition from pidgin to Creole. Derek Bickerton, a highly influential linguist who worked extensively with Hawaiian Creole English, proposed what he called the language bioprogram hypothesis. His claim was that when children nativize a pidgin, they draw on an innate set of universal grammatical principles hardwired into the human brain. This would explain a striking observation: Creole languages that developed independently, Haitian Creole, Tok Pisin in Papua New Guinea, Jamaican Patois, Nicaraguan Sign Language, share surprisingly similar grammatical structures, even though their source languages are completely different. Bickerton argued this convergence is evidence of a universal language faculty.
Student, Professor Ashford, is Bickerton's hypothesis widely accepted? It seems like a pretty strong claim that grammar is literally built into our DNA.
That's a fair challenge, and honestly, the hypothesis remains controversial. Supporters point to the cross-Creole grammatical similarities as compelling evidence. Critics, however, argue that Bickerton overstated the structural uniformity between Creoles and that many of the grammatical features he identified as universal actually differ significantly from one Creole to another. Some linguists prefer a more sociolinguistic explanation, that similar social conditions during creolization, such as the dominance of a colonial language and the mixing of diverse substrate languages, naturally produce similar outcomes without requiring an innate language program. The debate is very much alive. What's not debated, though, is that creolization represents one of the fastest and most dramatic forms of language change we have ever observed. I also want to briefly mention the social dimension of Creole languages, because it's inseparable from the linguistic one. Creoles have historically been stigmatized, viewed as broken or corrupt versions of the European colonial languages from which much of their vocabulary is drawn. Haitian Creole, for instance, derives much of its lexicon from French, and for a long time it was dismissed as simply bad French. This attitude has had real consequences for education policy and social mobility in Creole-speaking communities. Today, however, there is growing recognition of Creoles as fully legitimate, rule-governed languages, and many Creole-speaking nations, including Haiti, have adopted their Creole as an official language alongside the former colonial language.
That is the end of the lecture 2. You now have some time to answer the questions. Lecture 3. You will hear part of a lecture about art history. Impressionism movement. First, you have some time to look at the 6 questions. Now listen carefully and answer the questions.
Let me begin today by asking you to forget, just for a moment, everything you think you know about Impressionism. Most people encounter it through museum gift shop posters, soft, dreamy images of water lilies and sunlit cafes, and they assume it was immediately beloved. But the historical reality is almost the exact opposite. When the group of painters we now call the Impressionists first exhibited their work in Paris in 1874, the critical reception was overwhelmingly hostile. One of the most famous dismissals came from a journalist named Louis Leroy, who wrote a satirical review of Claude Monet's painting Impression, Sunrise. Leroy used the word impression as an insult, implying the work was a lazy, unfinished sketch rather than a serious painting. The artists, in a defiant move, adopted the term for themselves, and Impressionism was born as a name. To understand why the work was so controversial, you have to understand the institution it was rebelling against. The Académie des Beaux-Arts and its annual exhibition, the Salon, dominated the French art world in the 19th century. The Salon jury had very clear preferences: large-scale history paintings and mythological scenes, meticulously rendered with smooth brushwork and precise lines, no visible brushstrokes, no ambiguity. The Impressionists rejected virtually every one of these conventions. They painted everyday subjects, street scenes, dance halls, train stations, women in gardens. They painted outdoors, en plein air, to capture the way natural light actually falls on surfaces at different times of day. And they used short, visible brushstrokes with unmixed colors placed side by side, allowing the viewer's eye to blend them optically rather than mixing them on the palette. This technique of optical color mixing was deeply influenced by contemporary scientific research into color perception. Michel-Eugène Chevreul, a French chemist, had published his law of simultaneous color contrast earlier in the century, demonstrating that the way we perceive a color is affected by the colors placed next to it. The Impressionists, particularly Georges Seurat, though he's more properly called a post-impressionist, took this idea and pushed it to its logical extreme with a technique called pointillism, placing tiny dots of pure color next to each other so they would blend in the viewer's eye at a distance. Even among the core Impressionists, though, this scientific awareness shaped the way they thought about capturing light and atmosphere.
Student, Professor Ellery, you mentioned they painted outdoors to capture light, but didn't earlier painters also paint landscapes? What made the Impressionists so different from, say, the Romantics?
Great question, and it gets to the heart of what was truly radical about Impressionism. Yes, Romantic painters like Caspar David Friedrich and even the Barbizon school in France did paint landscapes, and the Barbizon painters, in particular, were an important precedent for the Impressionists. But there's a crucial difference. Romantic landscape painters were primarily interested in conveying emotion, the sublime, the spiritual power of nature. Their landscapes were carefully composed, often painted in the studio from sketches, and the emotional message was primary. The Impressionists were interested in perception itself, in capturing a specific, fleeting moment of light and atmosphere exactly as the eye registers it. They were asking, what does this scene look like right now, at 3 p.m, in September, with haze on the water? The subject was almost secondary to the light. That shift, from emotional expression to perceptual accuracy of a transient moment, is what makes Impressionism genuinely revolutionary. I also want to note that Impressionism's emergence was aided by a very practical technological development, the invention of portable paint tubes. Before paint tubes became commercially available in the 1840s, painters had to prepare their own pigments fresh each day and work near their studios. The collapsible metal paint tube made it easy to carry a full range of pre-made colors outdoors and work quickly in changing light. It's a small thing, but without it, the en plein air practice so central to Impressionism would have been far more difficult. Sometimes technological change and artistic revolution go hand in hand.
That is the end of the lecture 3. You now have some time to answer the questions. That is the end of the TOEFL iBT listening test. You now have some time to review your answers.
Hey people, how was your test? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, or you'll be missing out on some serious fun. See you tomorrow!